Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sarah Schultz, the Executive Director of the American Craft Council, and I am happy to see you all or welcome you all to our first American Craft Forum in association with our newly redesigned and relaunched American Craft magazine. I'm speaking to you today from the offices of the American Craft Council, which are located in the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. This place carries a complicated and layered history. In the thousands of years, the Dakota people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here. And in the several hundred years since European settlers colonized the land that the state of Minnesota now occupies. The United States land seizure was a project of destruction that denied the Dakota free and unhindered access to the land that fundamentally shapes their identity and lives. We pay tribute to the Dakota and Ojibwe and invite you all to consider the land on which you live and the confluence of legacies that bring you to stand where you are, particularly through critical reflection and conversation with your own community. Fostering conversation in a community is at the heart of ACC's mission, and American Craft serves as one of the most vital contributions in service to this mission and hopefully to the field of craft and American culture. Culture is not static and neither are magazines, and while the work of reimagining American craft, both as print and digital imprint this year, began prior to COVID, the deep challenges, upheavals, and losses we've experienced over the last year have influenced the tenor of the new magazine. Over the course of its 80-year history, American Craft has been at its best when rooted in the present moment, shining a light on the diversity and the resilience, the beauty and impact of American craft and its makers. And so this year, American Craft is refocusing on the ways that craft is guiding us through this extraordinary time, through the themes of nourish, flourish, kinship, and wonder. And with this inaugural issue of Nourish, we are looking to the question of care. But before I get to the heart of that topic, I want to thank the team at American Craft Magazine at the American Craft Council for all of their hard work, both on the relaunching of the magazine, Karen Olson, Roseanne Pereira, Rachel Messerich, and the full team that was able to really produce a new magazine over the last months. And I'd also like to thank the Minnesota State Arts Board for their support of culture in Minnesota and of the council and making this program possible. As a technical reminder, please make sure your camera is off and your audio is muted for the conversation, but we encourage you to participate in the talk via the chat feature, which I'm sure all of you know quite well by now, and drop any comments or questions there. During the Q&A portion of the event, we'll address as many of these questions as we possibly can, and we'll be keeping the chat so that we can follow up post-conversation. This program is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. So these last few months have marked 1 year of living under the shadow of a global pandemic that has caused all of us to know loss. We are also living under the ongoing shadow of acts of murderous violence, hate crime, bias, disregard, and here right now in these weeks in Minneapolis, the revisitation of the trauma with the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder and manslaughter of George Floyd. Our anger, our outrage, our fear, our exhaustion, and our losses are real. And the difficulties we have all grappled with this year have amplified fissures in our society's concepts of care. But we also know that we are creative communities and individuals, and as such, we know and live that there are other ways to be, other ways to build, and other ways to practice that move us from this crisis of care to a culture of care. Craft, we know, makes care tangible through our physical relationship to materials, through the movements and gestures of making. Craft also requires that we are attentive and we are present, and thus, like care, connects us to ourselves, the land, our shared humanity, and situates us to move towards the change we need. We have an incredible group of conversants today, and I first would like to begin by introducing our moderator, Beth McLaughlin. Beth is the Artistic Director and Chief Curator at the Fuller Craft Museum in Brockton, Massachusetts, and also the recipient of ACC's 2020 Award of Distinction. She has a very impressive resume that I will not read off to you, but I will introduce her just by saying, I know Beth and I know how passionate she is about expanding the awareness of the craft field, promoting makers, and really truly committed to the transformative power of handmade objects. So without further ado, I turn the program over to Beth McLaughlin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, I hope. Thank you, Sarah, for that warm introduction, and a big thanks to the American Craft Council for asking me to be part of this important conversation. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone here in the room. I am honored to be here with you all as we discuss how craft can be a pathway towards better care for ourselves, for others, and of course, for the world around us. The role of craft objects in providing comfort and care is nothing new, and we know this from the quilts on our beds, to the handmade mugs that hold our morning coffee, to the chairs that support our bodies, even as we are here on this program today. But in these times, it is worth taking a fresh look at how craft and craft practices can offer new methods of care. And I think it's particularly critical in these times as we emerge from the darkest days of the pandemic and begin to attend to our trauma from the past year. As Sarah mentioned, we've all suffered losses due to COVID-19. We've experienced destabilizing civil unrest, and we continue to witness repeated brutal acts of violence against people of color. So I'm sure we can all agree that care and healing is needed now more than ever before. And so this conversation is an important one. I'm honored to be here with two artists that center care in their practices, Indira Allegra and Shania Matson. We'll be hearing from each artist about their work today, and then we'll move into a larger discussion about how craft can serve as the foundation for an emergent culture of care. Please put any questions in the Q&A and we'll be sure to attend to those later in the program. And first, I would like to call Indira Allegra up to the virtual podium. Indira Allegra explores memorial as a genre and vital part of the human experience. Deeply informed by the ritual, relational, and performative aspects of weaving, Allegra explores the repetitive crossing of forces held under tension, be they material, social, or emotional. A leader in the performative craft movement, Allegra was winner of the 2019-2020 Burke Prize. They are a YBCA 100 honoree, Fleischacker Eureka Fellow, Lucas Artist Fellow, and part of Artforum International's Best of 2020. It is such a joy and a pleasure to be in conversation with you here today, and welcome to the program.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Indira Allegra. I use they, them pronouns, and I am calling in from unceded Chochenyo Ohlone territory, also known as Oakland, California. All right, so I was asked just to give a brief introduction to my work. For those of you who may be new, memorial is really important to me. So the way in which I think about the use of weaving is a way to kind of work with tension which exists in the world off the loom. So I think about tension both in a material sense. I think about tension in an emotional sense, a political sense, and a historical sense. And so what does it mean for me as a weaver to be able to work with interlocking tensions out in the world? This particular piece that you see here is called Immortal Word, and that's a jacquard woven book cloth with 18 karat gold. And inside of the book box are cards of which are printed onto organza of 52 folks who lost their lives as a result of work that they were doing politically, acts of self-determination So that could include folks like Annie Askew, who wanted a divorce during the Salem witch trials and was actually burned at the stake for wanting that for herself. Folks like Mahatma Gandhi, folks like Martin Luther King, so on and so forth. If you could advance the slide. So from each of their last words, and I spent about 3 months researching their last words, I created a new text from that, another poem. Thank you. So this particular, oh, here we go. Thank you. So this work here is installed in the Mills College Art Museum here in Oakland, California. Yes, and actually if we could go back to the...
Indira, if you give me just a moment, I'm going to set it to not auto advance.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm a fast talker, but not that fast. Awesome. So this is Open Casket 9. And what you see on the floor here is over 2,000 pounds of hand-shoveled granite, marble, dolomite, and concrete. And embedded in this ring is a 3-channel sound installation of families who have lost loved ones to police violence. Thank you. In the upper third of the room, what you see is a representation of a weaver's drawdown. So for the uninitiated, a drawdown is a way in which weavers map out the structure of cloth to see which threads are on top or which threads are hidden, and to get a sense of the density and the pattern and the texture of the cloth. And so what I've done with that grid making practice is to actually use video instead. And so in the video are families who have lost ones to police violence, and you hear their interviews interwoven into the 3-channel sound installation below. If you could advance the slide. Thank you. So here's a detail of the video, and this is all sourced from the internet. So I'm an avid news watcher, and in many times, or in many of these cases, camera crews have arrived sometimes an hour or so after the murder has taken place. So it's a practice of being able to stay with grief as it is being expressed, and to create memorials which more closely mirror the nature, I feel, of a grieving process, which is nonlinear. If you could advance to the next slide. This is documenting disability, so another way in which I think about using the act of weaving, and I do think of weaving as being primarily performative. If it wasn't for the durational performance of the weaver sitting at the loom, or and working with tools and materials, the actual cloth would not exist. So the performances, or the cloth, is born out of the performance of the weaver. And I was really interested in how I could create my own texts, or embed my own kind of language into a cloth through the act of raising and lowering threads while speaking. And so this is still from an 8-hour performance, which I did on my bed. Next slide. This is from the Body Warp series, specifically the casting series. And in Body Warp, I think about myself as a thread. So one of the desires which came out of the practice of weaving for me was a sense to feel the kind of support that my warp might when stretched across a floor loom. And as I'm sure many of you in the audience know, there's so much touch, and which happens with our threads. You know, threads are they're double strand twisted to begin with, and then they're dyed and they're dried and they're stretched, and there's all of this care which is happening for this material. And I wanted to be able to experience the loom supporting the weight and tension of me, the tension within my body, and not just the weight of my expectations for whatever cloth I might create. So in this particular series, I'm actually working with the tension of a history which exists at this site, which was a suicide which occurred at this site. A suicide of a woman by the name of Pamela Gerasi. And rather than move away from that feeling of discontent or haunting, the question for me became, how can my body as a thread, and how can these looms as bodies which are built to hold tension actually work on this narrative tension, this historical tension in this space? And so the body warp casting performance comes out of that. If you could advance the slide. And again, this is a body warp double cloth series wherein I'm working with a fabric aerialist, Kapelny Kalnick. And I was really interested in their relationship to cloth and cloth making as an aerialist. And for a short time, I trained circus as well, just to kind of get an understanding of what it would mean to entrust the full weight of my body to cloth and what I could learn from that. And so in the double cloth series, you see us using our bodies as thread through these loom pieces and sculptures. And the next slide. And this is a woven account wherein I take newspaper stories of hate crimes against LGBTQ and Two-Spirit people here in the Bay Area, and I weave them into a shroud that I then took to the different places, which are detailed in the newspaper articles, and did a public performance around this. Next slide. This is Surrogate, Mother to Myself. Also done for Pamela Gerasi, and what you see here are two redwood logs and 600 feet of cotton lead line rope, which she used to work with horses. And so Pamela was someone who had a deep relationship with horses during her life. And so in learning a bit more about her life, it was important to me to use materials which she had handled with care while she was alive. And so this was up from the winter solstice of 2017 through the winter solstice of 2018 as a temporary installation and memorial for her. Next slide. And there we go. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Indira. Fascinating as always. And, you know, as you discussed here, a lot of your practice is centered on the grieving process and the importance of memorials. And I'd love to hear just a little bit more from you about the criticality of material in that process and the importance of material in helping us move through loss and find a way forward.
First, I want to say that I think that when we care for our losses, we're actually more available to life and everything that life can offer us. So
Yeah.
I think on the surface, you know, it might be easy to be like, oh, memorial, oh, that's a sad show. But actually, I think it's a really vital practice for us to be able to, when we care for our losses, we reduce the amount of suffering which exists in our lives. And then if we include ourselves in the big story, it means that we're actually reducing the amount of suffering which exists in the world overall. And I think I feel most nourished by people who have cared for the losses in their lives, right? So, you know, when acts of violence occur, uh, you know, and I myself am a hate crime survivor. One of the things that occurs to me is, one of many things that occurs to me is what loss was not cared for in this person's life.
Mm. Wow. Wow, that's a really powerful way to look at it. And I would imagine that it's critical for you in order to move through your trauma to have that
Yeah,
perspective.
absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, because I think that a lot of this um, aggression is learned,
Yeah.
you know? Um, so when deciding to make a memorial of any kind, I think for me, I have to think about who I'm trying to honor. Um, if that's work for me to do as an artist, or maybe that's work for another artist to do. I don't
Yeah.
assume that I'm the artist for all projects. Um, and you know, say for the surrogate mother to myself, I'm using redwood and uh, cotton lead line rope because that mattered to Pamela. Not because I thought um, one way or another about it, or you know, oh, I just thought this would be an interesting combination to put
Yeah.
together. You know,
No, I
it's
think by decentering yourself also in that process, it really it's a very generous way to practice. And I think that's a really beautiful, compassionate way. Yeah. Um, and I remember from the letter to from Penelope that you wrote for the American Craft magazine, you had some beautiful words about the importance of grief. And I'm wondering if you could just maybe find a small portion of that article and just read it for us, because I will not do it justice. So I would love for you to do that for us.
let
And
me see what I can find. So I'll read the uh, I'll start at the page of top of 65. I cared for my mourning self by turning to thread to mark the passage of time and my feeling of suspension within it. I needed the gentle hiss of weft being pulled from the shroud. That flossing of the warp was a way for me to weep quietly at night while I waited for the part of myself I call Odysseus to return back to the home of my body. The performance of weaving and unraveling was the memorial I needed, not the shroud. I needed to show people I was unraveling inside, and this honesty was the most nourishing thing. I believe we can use materials to perform the memorials we need, which come out of our body's own unique relationship to grief. The era of solely relying on larger than life physical memorials and public squares to represent a universal experience of grief, that's waning. Each of us needs to take responsibility for making our own memorials specific to our own experiences of loss. Those of us who have skills as makers are especially gifted to meet the moment. We can craft new mythologies for the world we want to live in, and the understanding that loss will always be a normal part of lived experience. We can use the qualities of courage and patience, which are cultivated through our art practices, to take an honest assessment of the historical materials we have been offered, soaked as they are with complexity, and learn how to transform them into something that, if nothing else, adds meaning to our lives. And I believe a life of meaning may be the most nourishing thing of all.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for reading that. It's really just very moving and meaningful. Thank you. And we'll dive more into that later on in the program today. Right now, I would like to welcome and introduce Shania Matson, our next featured artist here today. Shania is an artist, writer, environmental activist, and cultural community organizer. Through slow and emergent arts activism, Shania tries to create a more caring and reciprocal culture, shifting narratives, challenging hierarchical power structures, and helping her community reimagine and transform the systems these shape. She is one of the co-founders of Water Bay and Public Studio, and her most recent artwork addresses resource extraction, rural identity, and community survival. She is also a single mother and lives in rural Palisade, Minnesota. So welcome, Shania. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Beth, and it's
You're
really
welcome.
great to be here with all of you. I want to just start by expressing my gratitude to the American Craft Council, to Indira and Beth for their all that they've shared today. This has been a really engaging and important conversation. And also I want to thank my mother, who's not on here, and she doesn't often get to attend these things, but she's a real inspiration for how I think about care, and also takes care of my children so that I can participate in things like this and be involved in community in lots of ways. And also to all of the human and non-human or more than human beings that make all of this possible. I think you can go ahead and start the slides. Mine are just randomly scrolling, and it's a number of slides that show different projects that I'm working on. And before I get into that, I want to place myself a little bit more where I'm zooming in from. So Beth mentioned that I'm north of Palisade, Minnesota. Palisade is in Aiken County, Minnesota, which is occupied Anishinaabe territory, and specifically the 1855 treaty territory. And more specifically than that, I'm on the Mississippi River, right at the edge of the construction of the Line 3 oil pipeline, which I'll talk a little bit about because a number of the projects that I'm working on around resource extraction are actually engaged with what it means to be part of an Indigenous-led resistance movement. And as a non-native person, I come into this space as someone whose family has actually been here in Aiken County, here in the 1855, for 6 generations, specifically about a mile from the pipeline resistance camp, where I'm living and working now. My grandmother was born. And so those stories about relationships with land and how we individually come to the places that we are part of this story about a crisis of care and a culture of care, because I really believe that beyond just acknowledging where we are, that taking accountability, truth telling, trying to heal those relationships is really part of the work that we do. So I'll just speak to the image that you see here. This is a group of children, including my children. You can keep advancing it, it's fine. And here we're making flags that look like the construction flagging that Enbridge has used to mark the route for this oil pipeline, but the children are writing their wishes, that the things that they would like to say to those construction workers when they come in to cut these trees down. And we place those flags alongside the flags that the oil company had put there, marking where the trees were to be cut and where the pipe was to be laid. And we actually worked with those children to help them raise their voices in protest of this pipeline. All of my work is really collaborative. It happens over long spans of time. Each project evolves over years. So Water Bar and Public Studio is one project that you'll see images of in here. That was a project that started out much like this as a small workshop that was done in public to help people think about where their water comes from. So we would serve drinking water for free in public spaces, and we would share with people the source of that water. That project went on for it's been about 6 or 7 years now. And over time, it went through being a pop-up space to being a storefront where we did community engagement around water equity. Then we also collaborated with the Dakota Language Society to launch a version of Water Bar that they called Miniaway, which is a Dakota word that means a place to gather water. And in that case, when we shared that water, we would talk about the Dakota language and how important it is to this place and to this land. And that's just an example of how in the work that I do, I think of that attention to material and the stories of material, whether that be water that we drink and that we bring into our bodies, or that comes through our homes and through our communities. Thinking about the origin of that and all the stories that it carries with it. I also have a project that you'll see some images of here that is about mining and the resource extraction that happens. Now you're seeing images of what this was taken last week. So this is where the pipeline that I mentioned has been laid underground, and now we're in mud season. And so it's flooded, and you can really see what a mark that extraction has left on the land. So I think a lot about that culture of extraction really being a crisis of care. It is, if we're permitted to abuse land in this way and to abuse water, how does that abuse get integrated then into our sense of who we are? So in the community that I come from, a lot of people are really about, they're very much pro pipeline and pro mining. And the arguments that they use is that these are the jobs that we do. These are the jobs that we need. And I think that really speaks to a crisis of care when you're in this position that the only job that you can imagine for yourself is one destroying the place that you live and destroying the water that you drink as well. And so through these art projects, I'm trying to engage with those industries of extraction and really look at the material and the way that human bodies are instrumental in that extraction, and then using that material to create in community. So with the mining project, for example, I take red earth that is called overburden by the mining companies, and I use that as a dye to dye fabric. And that fabric then that I've gathered from women in the community, I dye and then I print stories onto that fabric that I've also gathered from the community. And here you can see an image of what that fabric looks like when it's been dyed with that red earth. And so in some ways, that process of gathering that material from sites of extraction and then using it to color this cloth and then working with it, my hands become red. I invite other people into this process through these pop-up workshops. And while we're doing that work with this material, we're telling stories. And a lot of the stories that we're telling are about those family relationships or those historic relationships with land and with industries of extraction. And that naturally leads to talking a lot about abuse and talking about grief and about gendered and racialized violence and how these are part of the culture of our community. And so Water Bar is one example of that. I mentioned a little bit, this Overburden Overlook project. And then now I have recently, last fall, I moved from Minneapolis back to my hometown here in Palisade to live in the Line 3 resistance camp. So I live on a property here on the Mississippi River called Aking, which is an Anishinaabe word that means the land to which the people belong. And I'm living here and working with a network of Native women and other allies who are leading resistance to Line 3. And what I'm doing specifically is working with cultural projects like these, involving people in the creation of these different craft objects as one way to advance those conversations, and then also to do some healing work around culture. And so I think I'm gonna, I feel like the slides are sort of out of order, which I take responsibility for that. I gave them as a big slideshow, but I think it would be good maybe to transition to just having conversation, Beth, and we can talk a little bit more about some of the details.
Sure, absolutely.
And we can
Um,
keep the slides going while we talk so we can get through the rest of them. Is that possible, or does that overload the system?
No, it's just fine. They're back on.
And Rachel,
um,
no one needs to apologize. They're just, I mean, the work that I do is very much nonlinear. I'm glad that Indira mentioned that as well, because a lot of these projects, you know, the process of being in community and hearing stories and working with material, it all blends and bleeds together. And I very rarely exhibit this work in the context of a museum. Most of the time, this work is received as a public workshop, or I make objects like these. These are felted wool taconite pellets that we made in community to talk about mining, and those get gifted to women who are doing work to protect the water. So I think if we just jump in, and if they can keep scrolling, that would be good.
yes, absolutely. And I'm thinking about something you said with the pop-up workshops and the stories that you are hearing from the different participants. And I see that also as a form of extraction in a way. And what I'm really interested in about your work is your ability to use this notion of extraction, but really transform it into something more regenerative. So could you speak a little bit more about how you hope to kind of flip the script, as it were, and really take extraction and have it be more sustainable and about renewal, really?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that way of thinking about the world, that extraction culture that's imprinted on so many of us, and it colors the way that we see the world and that we see our relationships to others. There is a way that doing narrative work can be very extractive. You know, here in the Line 3 movement, a lot of journalists show up, and it seems sometimes like they have the story in mind that they want to extract. And then those of us who are here are just sort of performance. We're part of a performance of the story that they've already decided is what's important. What I try to do with the workshops is I bring material in just as a suggestion for conversation in a way. It's like if you can get your hands on that red earth and you can feel it on your hands, and then you're working with wool, or you're working with fabric that's being dyed, or printing with relief. It brings up stories that people then didn't even realize maybe that they needed to share, because that relationship with material, it helps to recall something for them. And so I try to create those spaces where people feel welcome to share those kinds of stories, and then I'm able to deeply listen. Because I am also, you know, recalling my own stories. I'm sorting through my own relationships with this place, and with this culture. And my hope, and I've heard from participants in these workshops, my hope is that by slowing down and being in that space together and sharing those stories, that it actually is healing. That there's a way that being recognized in that circle helps to heal the from so much erasure. You know, a lot of the workshops I'm doing with the mining project, for example, are with women. And it's stories of women's labor and caregiving that seem to be erased from so much of these conversations about the future and jobs and extraction. You know, here people talk about the Line 3 oil pipeline as if it's going to bring the jobs to this region, but they never say that these are jobs primarily for men.
Yeah.
And primarily for white men. And so there's things that get left out, and that is what's erased. And so being in those workshops where we can tell our stories is healing.
Yeah. In fact, we had a comment in the chat that said reciprocity, not extraction. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it also. Well, our hour is zooming by, so I wanted to save some time for us, the three of us, to share the space and to talk more about some of the topics at hand. So I'd love to have Indira please come back and join us. Okay, so we had a wonderful call before this to prepare for our conversation. And one of the discussion points that we had was this idea of decentralizing the object. as a way to create more meaningful pathways to care moving forward. And I would love to hear from each of you your thoughts on the role of objects in this emergent culture of care, and how important is this final outcome of practice. And I think Indira, let's hear from you if you don't mind.
Decentral. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's important to remember that we bring so much to objects, so it isn't, you can have all the stuff, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will enjoy it or that this will be, you can have a thing, but it may not be nourishing to you if you can't enjoy it. I also think that it's about how we can, as makers, be sculpted by our practices. That's much more interesting to me. So what I get to demonstrate for you is how I am woven, how deeply I have taken these lessons to heart in my meditation, in my thinking about working with tension off the loom, and my courage to be able to do that. That's how weaving shapes me. And I think that we're so privileged as makers to be able to have those practices as a resource, as teachers, to shape our insides.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, you had a beautiful quote in your letter also that says, craft is not about the object so much as it's about our relationship over time with that which touches us back. So I think that is a really extraordinary way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Shania, what are your thoughts on taking the object and looking at it in different ways?
Yeah, that all really resonates with me. And I think a lot about the stories that objects are, that they carry for us as individuals. And a lot of that does come from our relationship to creating. If it was an object that we then spent that time and took that care to create, but also the material. I'm really interested in the stories behind material, and not just where it comes from, you know, the kind of natural source of various materials, or the way that they were created, but also the relationships that bring those into our lives. So, you know, with Water Bar, when we were serving water, we were really, I really thought of that as serving water, you know, that we were serving water by helping to carry these stories forward of it, of, you know, the aquifer that water was drawn from, or the river, and the work that was done to make that water clean enough to drink, or the abuse that was done on the land that made that water unsafe, unhealthy. So bringing those stories into objects, for me, helps to give meaning to those relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, rooted in both of your practices very strongly is this importance of land and of place. There are these threads of caring for place and communing with place. And Shania, even on your website, you stated that your goal is to recognize and deepen your own relationship with people and places they inhabit. And that really resonated with me. And I know Indira, in some of your conversations, I'm sorry, site-specific installations, you think very deeply about how you can be of service to the places that you are inhabiting during your practice. So I would love to hear from you both about what role does place have in your practice, and also how can we activate that moving forward and trying to create this culture of care.
Shania, did you want to
That's really the question, isn't it?
I know, right?
Um, I mean, my mind goes in a bunch of places, and of course, I'm thinking about what Indira shared, and it's working its way through my brain. I really place for me is really about those relationships. I mean, relationships really are everything. And I think that a culture in crisis, a culture of extraction, really erases and breaks those relationships through encouraging meaning that is derived from consumption, that is simply about what we can consume or what we can control. And so I think about craft, and I think about creating, and the work that I do, and that I hope the projects help others discover that side of themselves, about bringing people into relationship with place. And that can happen every day. I had some images in my slide presentation of what we're doing now in our here at this we call it the Welcome Water Protector Center. The resistance camp here is that we're sugaring. And so right now we're tapping maple trees. And there's a way we could do that in a very extractive way. People do that. They don't have a relationship. It's just, what can I get from this tree? But when we set up the sugar bush this year, we were led by Ojibwe people who have long-standing relationships with this practice of sugaring, who offered a prayer, who helped us understand that we have to be in good relationship to the land, and to these beings, and that the sugar is a medicine in that case, that it becomes medicine. So I think through changing our relationships and deepening those relationships, then this work of living becomes a kind of medicine that nourishes us, rather than the depleting emptiness, I guess, of constant consumption. So I don't know if that I kind of went all around there, but that was what came to mind.
That resonates a lot with me. I feel like the story that a place can offer up, or the history which exists there, is also part of the teaching of a place. I don't believe that there's any such thing as like blank space. There's no blank pages, no blank canvases, there's always a narrative which exists before I arrive at a place. And and I think to be curious and open to life is to be curious about what exists there,
Yeah.
and what wants to reveal itself to you. I believe there's a front side of the cloth and there's a back side of the cloth to everything. And so it's not my expectation that everything should always be revealed to me. Sometimes you can feel the presence of an unspoken thing, and that's all you're going to get, is the feeling of the presence of the unspoken thing. You'll never get the articulated version that you can understand. But I think that is what is so wonderful about being an artist, is that we are trained to have the strength to stand in the face of the unknown, and to be in deep acceptance of that, and still be able to move around, still be able to work. So, for me, a place is anywhere where multiple voices are gathered. So this is a place, and all of us have a front side and a back side to our cloth.
That's beautiful. I would also love to hear a little bit about your process, Indira, when you start a project, and because I know it's a very intuitive process, and how you commune with place in order to inform how the work will proceed, what the final outcome will be. If you could share a little bit about that process.
I'll tell the story about the surrogate mother to myself. So for those of y'all who were watching the slideshow, it's the piece with the redwood logs and the cottonweed lime rope. And when I first arrived, to that residency, I had a really difficult time sleeping at night. And rather than just dismissing that and being like, oh, well, it's, just must be me buzzing around, blah, 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 I just kind of bookmarked it. And I said, that's important too. Everything's important. I think it's like when you're on residency, like everything is like information, like when you're making a work, right? And the next day we were given orientation to the space, and we're told that the place had actually been set up in Pamela Geraci's honor, and that she had died by suicide on that land many years before. And then they went on to talk about how beautiful the view was and how our meals would be cooked for us every night. And I was like, whoa, slow down.
Yeah, go back to what you said. Yeah.
Exactly. And so then I began to ask other questions about Pamela's life and see if there were creative works of hers that I would be able to have access to. And in this case, that's where I was able to get my hands on a book of her poems and realize what materials actually mattered to her through reading her own poetry about her daily life. And so, but all of that started with not being able to sleep at night and taking that experience so seriously, and then move from that place and say, I feel like there's a question here. Move from that place into a space of research. So I feel like all questions are born from a place of intuition. You got to have a hunch to know what to ask to start researching.
Right. Right. And I think as artists, if you're not able to get in touch with that deeper sense of intuition, that it's going to be a problem. I mean, that's really such a big part of being creative and being an artist is really being able to kind of drop into that space for yourself and for your practice, for sure. Yeah. Shania, I wanted to ask you a question about your time at the Water Welcome at the Pipeline Opposition Camp. And I imagine that it's very emotionally taxing, physically, mentally. And I'm wondering about self-care for you, and that are there practices that you put in place to take care of yourself in order to really do your best work at the camp?
Yeah, that's a great question. So much of what we're doing here is this really collective remembering of how to take care of each other and how to take care of ourselves. And our camp is right directly adjacent to the pipeline construction. And so this doesn't exactly answer your question, but it is very nourishing to me to be part of a community that is caring for itself and caring for each other and caring for the land. And those daily practices have become really, really important to me, that I don't sidestep those, that I don't just hop on a computer to do the organizing work that I need to do, but that I actually go out and help chop wood, and that I go out and, I help cook the meals that we eat together. I do my part as much as possible. And then also, I'm spatially, we have this camp, and on two sides, on one side is the construction or the destruction. And then on the other side is an access road that trucks are driving down all day long, full of men who are going to work on this pipeline. And then on this side over here is the Mississippi River. And that's why we're here. That's why we're here, to protect that water, but also that water gives us life. And so, whenever I'm starting to feel overwhelmed by proximity to destruction and to carelessness, I can go to the river and I can be reminded that it's really care. That's why we're here. And so that extends, to myself. To do that care work is also a way to care about my own spirit.
Yeah, and I think too, engaging in political action in such a way, if you don't embed care into it on a very sustainable way, you won't be able to continue to do it for these protracted amounts of time. So I think that that's really important to have, to be able to take care of yourself and to be able to take care of others and have that part of the system in place to continue the work that you're doing.
Well, yeah, and I think recognizing that our movements are spaces of care and creation.
Mhm.
You know, that it can seem sometimes, I think, to folks who are outside of that somewhat, that, you know, we stand around and we hold signs and we yell. But there's actually there's actually a lot of care that goes into just maintaining our relationships with each other as we build movements, and that is challenging. You know, it isn't always, we're not always getting along either. You know, I've had a lot of really hard lessons being back here in the place that I grew up, and realizing how many stories I didn't know and how many things I'd never acknowledged. And I have to do that work, it to be
Right.
accountable. So there's a lot
Yeah.
of care that needs to happen. Yeah.
And I would say, thank you so much for this, Shania. I would say also that it's multi-generational as well. So who is I really? You know? Yes, I sit here as Indira on the Zoom call, but there's so many other forces which make my life and work possible. And I think when thinking about, yeah, when thinking about care, it really has to be vast. It's for stuff that we're not going to see in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Hopefully, there's a lot of stuff I'd like to see, but I accept that there are many things that, you know, that I have to do for my niece and whoever my niece is caring for and whoever they're caring for. And you just keep going generations out.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
by, I just want to say, and that by like, choosing to live in a, what I feel is a dignified way by centralizing movements of care, I am also caring for stuff that my ancestors were hoping for me to be able to experience this time around. They didn't have the option to.
Yeah.
So it moves in all directions. It's not just about the here and now, I feel.
Yeah. I think acknowledging that continuum is very important and certainly one to keep in mind. And we've just reaching an hour, and I wanted to save a little bit of time for questions. And we had one comment, actually, an interesting observation from an attendee. Shania's process makes me think about the attempts by some who claim and practice privilege of extraction, erasure, discarding of those they see as other. So I think that's an astute point. One woman said, "Thank you for your deep work and thoughtfulness. Stay in touch with yourself. You're both very special." Just scanning here for any questions. Lots of great comments. It's wonderful. Wow, this is great. I had one other question, if we have a little bit of extra time. It's about collective care, and I think we've touched on this a little bit, but what can we glean from these modalities of relational care with the people around us, with our communities, with the land, with non-human entities, and how can we take that forward? And I think that might be a good question to end on, unless we get some more in the chat.
I guess I could start to think that one out. I mean, I really believe in these collective spaces of creation and care as practice for how we move forward in a wider way. I also get involved in policy making and in other sorts of activism work where I'm in spaces that folks who've been elected to work on these things from a policy standpoint, where they create those policies. And one of the things I've seen we're introducing these public art projects and spaces into, it's like merging those two. That extractive or that dehumanizing or objectifying hierarchical way of thinking, when it makes its way into the spaces where policy is made, or where cities are planned, or where, you know, these other decisions get made, it influences the outcome kind of downstream. So if we can create these spaces of care, and these spaces of collective care, I think of it like water flowing upstream of where many of those behaviors and those decisions are happening, then we can hopefully shape how that happens in a more caring way. You know, I specifically introduced some of those workshops into spaces where policymakers would be standing in circle with community folks who've been most impacted by their decisions. And to be in that circle where everyone is face to face and not in a hierarchical way, but like we're all drinking the same water, and we're all using the same material. It creates this sense of possibility that we could really reshape systems if we think in the long term, and we think in the ways that we engage with one another and with the world.
Yeah.
Ooh-wee. There's something which comes up to the surface for me about humility. And that when you come to your studio, whatever your studio is, and maybe your studio is a space outside, that you don't assume that you know what it is or what the story is. So someone looks at me and they assume I'm a woman, but I'm not a woman. But when we begin to be in relationship with each other, and there's a practice of deep listening, then you begin to understand the worlds within worlds which exist within my they, them. And it is, I think, the kind of deep listening, so shout out to Pauline Oliveros, the kind of deep listening, the kind of patience, the kind of humility to approach a studio and to say, or a material and to say, you know what? I actually don't know. Teach me. Cotton, what do you want to do? Clay, what do you want to do today? You know? And that's what I mean when I talk about using craft to sculpt our insides.
Yeah.
The world isn't going to change because someone's going to come up with a magical object. The world's going to change because we're changing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just circles right back to our earlier discussion about taking the object out of the equation. That's not what it's about. But, you know, in the traditions of craft, I mean, that's a pretty radical thought. I mean, for so long, it's been about the object as you know, kind of the final destination, as it were. So I love this conversation because I think it's really important as we move forward and really thinking about how to create a more caring society through craft, through making. What does that mean? And really decentralizing the object, I think, is a very important point. And I'm going to be thinking a lot about it from here on out, because I think it's really beautiful and powerful. And I love that whole conversation we've been having. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I see Sarah has popped back up.
I just wanted to say that was a really beautiful thought, and I'm going to be sitting with that. What do you want to do?
Well, I came back on just to thank everybody. I know we had a few questions we didn't get to, as is always the case. So it'll be great to find a way to continue the conversation. And I just really want to thank all of you for what has just been a moment of great pause and reflection to really both learn more about how you work, how you create, and the way you're moving into the world, which is inspiring for all of us. So I want to thank everybody for coming today too. This is, we have recorded this session and we'll be getting it up on the site. And if you're interested in continuing to read and more fabulous voices from the world of craft, I encourage you all to get a subscription to American Craft Magazine as we move ahead into Flourish and Kinship and Wonder in the coming year. And I feel very privileged and honored to be in the presence of all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and American Craft Council. And thank you, Shania and Indira.
Thank you both. Thank you to the American Craft Council. Thank you to everyone in the chat, both in the States and internationally. Yes. Just really enjoying y'all. It's been fun. And Shania, what an honor. Thank you so much. I hope our paths cross again.
Yeah, thank you. You really gave me a lot to think about. I'm excited to go jump into working on something now. Ooh, that was nourishing.
I know, I'm all like, let's get to work. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.